I made another level. It's already been released. It's called Toxic Underground, and I'm just gonna talk about it as we watch some sped up footage of me making it. I started by choosing a general palette. I don't use anywhere near all of this, but these objects kind of matched the idea that I had in my head in terms of concept and the color. So speaking of concept, this is kind of inspired by a level from an SMW hack called Scary Bosses and Nice Sprites, where it was kind of a toxic level and it had alligators in it. And then that got me thinking of Where's My Water? You know, like the mobile game with the alligator in the shower. So we end up having pipes pumping out toxic stuff, which end up being the green spikes. And yeah, that's kind of where the ideas came from. So I am using the dark lead blocks as the safe ground to stand on. We've got the sludge blocks. That's not what they're called. They're called slippy goo. I'm probably gonna call them sludge blocks. So those kind of represent the toxic ground. Obviously, they are very safe to walk on. They just affect your movement in that you slide on them. So I use a lot of green spikes throughout to make them dangerous. So at this point, I'm actually realizing I think I'm doing too much, too fast, and also just too much in general. I'm already using two different types of enemies with very different movement, so that quickly ends up becoming just using one type of enemy. We'll see that later. So now I'm trying to figure out how I want these pipes to look that are pouring out the toxic sludge. A little more level creation, and then it's time to test. Testing early and testing often is very important because I can immediately see there's a lot of things wrong here. I don't like how the camera is lined up, or how high these things are. Mostly that was a camera problem. At this point in the level creation process, it's still not fixed. I do figure it out later. So I'm still trying to get a feel of what I want this level to be. So right now I'm using a bunch of flapjacks. Kind of the idea was going over the first set of enemies, they're not going to be able to hurt you. Going over the second set of enemies, now they're actually a danger. Kind of introducing you slowly to what's going on. This is another concept I had where sometimes the enemies could bounce you up into danger, and it's very much inspired by the level from the Scary Bosses and Nice Sprites hack. So at this point, I'm switching out the flapjacks for the blobfush. This is because the blobfush movement is much more predictable. I think the flapjacks look a lot better with the concept, however, I think the blobfush functions significantly better for this level. Alright, time for more testing. First set of blobfush, completely below the semi-solid. Then I discover, hey, you can't make that jump without sprint speed, which is not what I want. So that needs to change. Second set of blobfush can come up and hit you. Where this spike section is needs to change though. And also I want it to look better. So I'm not ready to introduce this concept in the level yet, so I'm just pushing it aside, but I wanted to get it built because I like the idea. And also I needed to test it because it's not doing what I want currently. I want the spikes to be a threat, but the blobfush only bounce you up so high, so need to lower the spikes some. Now, I don't want all the pipes to come down and end at the same level, and like I said, the blobfush only bounce you up so much, so it's time for me to figure out how to make this still look good and still more threatening than it was. So I'm still not sure what I want to do in between yet, but I've got some other things to fix, like moving these platforms down because I would like to be able to get up onto them without having sprint speed. And since I already know that I'm introducing the dripping sludge spikes later in the level, I want to introduce them a little earlier just so that it's not weird that only that section or later sections have that. Now to figure out what to do in this in-between section. So the idea kind of was, we'll just make them jump over something and avoid spikes. Pretty simple. So I am going to use the jumping on the blobfish concept later in the level, but this is way too many ideas going on, too close to each other, and I'm not really developing any of them into what they could be. So currently, I thought this was pretty unfair, so we're making it a little simpler, removing some spikes, moving things closer. I'm not trying to make a crazy difficult level or anything like that. I tend to prefer making more casual levels. So I do end up adding more spikes back in. That's because I don't want it to just be a simple jumping over a pit of spikes. I mean, that's still what it is, but I want it to look a little better than just the pit of spikes on the bottom. So I add the dripping sludge spikes. So I'm doing a lot of testing of this jump, trying to make sure that it feels fair. And I do this a lot throughout the level creation process. So at this point, I've decided we're going to have pipes throughout the level, all over the place. However, pipes that are on dropping toxic sludge will only be above parts where there is toxic sludge on the ground. Parts where there is not the toxic sludge, like dangerous ones where there are spikes, will not actually be pumping out any green spike sludge. Alright, it's finally time to mess with the camera. I have never messed with the cameras in level creation prior to this, so using the camera anchor and the zoom were all new to me, so it was a bunch of experimenting, but it wasn't bad. I figured it out on my own in a relatively short amount of time, through just a lot of experimenting and seeing what's changing as I'm messing with the settings. I really like that we have the option to change what the player's field of view is, rather than having a predefined field of view that we have to work within. So now that the camera's all set, I was doing a little more testing of what I had so far, and I found out in the spot you could kind of get stuck. Not really, because the jump to the right is actually very easy. However, I wanted you also to be able to jump out to the left just in case. Alright, time to move on to the next section of the level, which is going to be introducing jumping on the blobfish in order to avoid the toxic sludge in some way. Starting this section, I'm actually going to be keeping it very simple, where you don't actually have to jump on the blobfish to get over. It's a very safe, teaching environment. However, with the next iteration, you're actually going to, in theory, need the blobfish. I know that you can actually get over it with sprint speed, but it's not a big deal. Like I said, the goal is a casual level, and that's what I'm focusing on. If people want to run through it at high speeds, go for it. It's not like it's actually breaking the level. It's just doing something not quite as intended. And you know what? That's fine. So now I'm working on what's to be the last section of the level. This isn't the last section based on how much I've built so far, but this is the final section of the level. So I want this to be the most challenging part. So we're doing the jumping on blobfish, avoiding some tighter spikes. This section gets a lot of testing to figure out exactly how I want this, and in a way that feels good, hopefully. After a little bit of testing, I already know that I do not like the ending in its current state. Those last set of spikes are way too easy to hit. So some things need to be moved around in order to make it more fair. I still wasn't really sure about the ending, and the length of the level I wasn't all that happy with, so I got distracted and decided to try out some aesthetic stuff to figure out what I want to do in the background, because I wasn't all for the plain background that I had going on. So I'm trying to add some like extra dimension of what would be kind of like background, like pipes. It goes through several iterations before I decide on something that I actually like. Eventually, I decide that I like the window panes. I think the color ties together the silver pipes and green sludge better than anything else that I had tried. So after getting sidetracked with some of the aesthetic stuff, it was time to get back to level creation and expand the level, because like I said before, I didn't like the length of it currently. It was too short. I need more stuff in here. One of those things being expanding on the concept of the blobfish coming up beneath you and bouncing you up into spikes potentially. So that's what I'm building out here. So as I was building this, I had a realization. Like, hey, the blobfish can only go a distance of 4. That is not far enough in my book. So I stuck a blobfish on a path so that I could move it however I wanted to. The speed and movement is a little different than the default, but I think it adds a little bit of variation, which can be good. You'll see later that I actually put at least one other blobfish on a path because I like the little bit of variation that it adds. So like I said before, this is an expansion on the previous idea with the blobfish coming up from beneath you and potentially bumping you into spikes. So I've upped the challenge here. I made it so you can't just walk across. There are now gaps in the platform, so you have to do a little bit of platforming and also avoidance of spikes and watch out where you're landing, or else the blobfish could potentially bump you up into spikes. Also, I added a checkpoint because now that the level is getting longer, I don't want to make it a frustrating experience if the player dies. And at this point, I'm still not done flushing out all the concepts, so there is more length that gets added afterwards. So I'm doing a lot of testing of this section. Again, I want the level to be fair. I don't want to be mean to the player by making something unreasonably difficult or just overly difficult compared to everything else. So it was a lot of testing and then tweaking some things and then more testing and making some more changes. I had a couple of realizations while I played the descending part here. One, it's significantly more fair now that the spikes are set apart. I hadn't tested it again after I moved them. Two, the blobfish are actually almost always reachable because they only descend down into the spikes. You can still technically die to the spikes if the blobfish is at this lowest point, but the likelihood of that is generally kind of low. So now I'm building out the small section in between the introduction to jumping on the blobfish to the ending where I want you to jump on blobfish and avoid spikes and all that. So it needed a transition in here of something that was a little bit more difficult, but not nearly as difficult as the end. Because in the first part of this, you don't have to technically jump on the blobfish at all. I am encouraging it, but it's not required. Now I want it to be more of a requirement. I do know that you can get over this with sprint speed. I don't really care. Like I said, it's a casual level, so I want to kind of teach the player what I am expecting of them. Alright, so now for the first test of, in theory, the full level. After this, it's mainly tweaking. I've got the layout for the level generally down at this point. and it feels decent to play, and these sections flow well, so the important part is done. Now for tweaking to help the feel of it. And here's where I realized the ending is still not in an okay state, in my opinion. I was still not happy with it, still didn't feel great. As I've said many times now, I wanted to make it pretty fair. So I want to make it generally pretty easy to get to the goal without having like a very bad setup that would potentially force you into spikes. But before fixing it, because I still wasn't sure how to fix it, I once again got distracted by some aesthetic stuff. And it's gem time! At this point, the level is pretty much done, other than the ending, which at this point I still haven't fixed. Now, I want to communicate my intentions to the player, and I know that some changes are going to be needed after I add the gems, so that's what we're doing now. So the way I personally add gems is I tend to communicate where the jumps are. In some sections, they're obviously not jumps, but sometimes they indicate like this is a safe spot. And then I do add some like bonus gems that are in areas where you don't really need to go there, but if you want to, there's a small little reward. Now for the ending. I struggled with the ending in terms of creation. I also struggled with the ending when it came to gem placement. I couldn't figure out where I wanted the gems to be in order to kind of communicate what I wanted. And also I wanted them to be pretty easy to grab, which turned out to be quite a bit of a challenge. So now I am finally fixing the ending. Turns out all it really needed was the second block bush to be lower than the other one, and it works out okay like that. So now I'm checking the positioning of gems to see that they are actually lining up with the path that I want the player to take. So here, for example, because I do want to encourage the player to bounce off the block bush, I may make that into a V to say, hey, this should kind of be the shape of your movement. So when I said placing gems for the ending was hard, here we are at that point. I'm doing a lot of testing here because I want it to be generally pretty easy to grab all of the gems, and in the end, I do actually end up with a pretty similar gem setup to what is here currently, but with just the gems moved closer to the block bush, so that they are easier to collect. So basically here, I'm experimenting with different timings, in other words, like different positions that the block bush could be in to see what the results are in terms of what gems I can get or will miss. And it's really just a lot of experimenting. And this is where we finally end up in terms of gem positioning. Now that they're closer to the block bush, it's significantly easier to get them since you have to jump off of the block bush anyways. You don't actually have to jump off the first one, you only need to jump off the second one. But if you want to collect all the gems, they're in easier positions now than they were before. And now for the clearing of the level for publishing. Kind of. Because, like I said, the level's already been published at this point. You can go out and play it already if you wanted to. Okay, for whatever reason, when I was trying to clear this level, I struggled with this jump a little bit. I had no problems clearing that jump when I was testing the level, and the jump's really not hard, it's just a full jump. But for whatever reason, I struggled with it a little bit when clearing the level. It's a little embarrassing considering I made the level. But yeah, here's the level. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Like I said, it is already out. It's been out for at least a week now when this video is coming out. So plenty of people have already played it. And now that I've cleared it, time to ship it. Although, like I said, it's already out, so it's already been shipped. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video and hearing some insight into how I make levels. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing, and hopefully I will see you next time.